The Vietnam War was one of the most controversial conflicts in American history. And even 50 years later, the war still shapes the way we think about the use of military force around the world. But it's not just the politicians and generals who learned lessons from that conflict. We can all learn a lot about ourselves, our country, and the nature of war by examining how Americans fought and died in Vietnam. In this video, we're going to look at 5 important lessons from the Vietnam War, what history teaches us today. When we think about the Vietnam War today, it's easy to focus on the mistakes the U.S. military made in the jungle, like how they initially underestimated the strength of the Viet Cong guerrillas, or how they struggled to fight an enemy that seemed to disappear into the dense Vietnamese jungle. But while these are certainly important parts of the story, they don't tell us the whole truth about what happened in Vietnam. One of the most important lessons we can learn from that war is how American foreign policy was shaped by the events of the 1960s and early 1970s. During the Cold War, the United States had a policy of containment, which aimed to stop the spread of communism around the world. This policy was developed in large part by George Kennan, who argued that the best way to contain the Soviet Union was to resist any efforts to expand communism. In the case of Vietnam, this meant supporting the South Vietnamese government against the communist North Vietnamese, who were backed by the Soviet Union and China. At first, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam was limited to providing economic and military aid to the South Vietnamese. But in 1964, after a series of attacks by North Vietnamese forces, the U.S. began to send in combat troops. Over the next few years, the number of American soldiers in Vietnam would grow to over 500,000. But despite the massive investment of blood and treasure, the U.S. was unable to achieve a decisive victory over the North Vietnamese. In fact, as the war dragged on, it became clear that the Americans were losing both military engagements and the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. Eventually, the U.S. was forced to withdraw from Vietnam in 1973, and 2 years later, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, ending the war and the U.S.'s involvement in it. The Vietnam War was a major turning point in American foreign policy. Before Vietnam, the U.S. had been willing to use military force to contain communism around the world. But the experience in Vietnam showed that this policy was not always successful, and that it often came at a great cost in blood and treasure. As a result, the Vietnam War led to a more cautious approach to foreign policy, one that emphasized diplomacy and negotiation over military intervention. This lesson has important implications for us today. In an increasingly interconnected world, it's easy to see conflicts through the lens of the Cold War. But doing so can lead to misunderstandings and costly mistakes. For example, many of the conflicts the U.S. is involved in today, such as the war in Afghanistan, are not simply battles between good and evil. There are often complex webs of interests, ideologies, and grievances at play. And in these situations, military force is rarely the best way to achieve American interests. Instead, diplomacy and negotiation are often more effective tools. Of course, there are times when military force is necessary, such as when defending against an imminent attack. But even in these situations, it's important to remember that war is a last resort, not a first option. The Vietnam War was a costly and controversial conflict, but it taught us an important lesson about the limits of military power. By understanding this lesson, we can better navigate the challenges of the 21st century. As we continue to grapple with the legacy of the Vietnam War, it's important to remember that it wasn't just a conflict between two armies. It was a war between two different ways of life. For the North Vietnamese, the war was a struggle for national liberation against a brutal and corrupt regime. For the South Vietnamese, on the other hand, the war was a fight to preserve their way of life against the threat of communism. And for the Americans, it was an effort to contain the spread of communism and protect an ally. In many ways, the Vietnam War was a tragedy for all sides involved. But perhaps no group suffered more than the Vietnamese people. Caught in the middle of a superpower struggle, the Vietnamese people endured years of violence, death, and destruction. Their country was devastated by the war, and millions of Vietnamese civilians were killed. Yet despite all this, the Vietnamese people never gave up hope. They fought back against the Americans and their allies, and eventually they won. Today, Vietnam is a free and prosperous country. Its economy has grown rapidly in recent decades, and its people enjoy a high standard of living. The Vietnamese War may be over, but its legacy lives on. It reminds us of the human cost of war and the importance of fighting for peace. It also teaches us the importance of understanding different cultures and perspectives. The Vietnamese War was a clash between two different ways of life, and it's a reminder that we can't always understand the motivations and beliefs of those who are different from us. But it's also a reminder that we should try to understand them anyway. After all, the only way to build a better future is to learn from the mistakes of the past. And yet, despite the tragic toll the war took on Vietnam and the world, there is still much to admire about the Vietnamese people. They showed incredible courage and resilience in the face of great adversity. They fought for their country and their freedom, and they ultimately won. The Vietnam War may be over, but the Vietnamese people's story is not. They are a testament to the human spirit and a reminder that we should never give up hope, no matter how difficult the situation may seem. While the U.S. military made many mistakes during the Vietnam War, perhaps their greatest failing was not military in nature, but political. At the start of the war, the U.S. government was not honest with the American people about the conflict in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson, who escalated the war in 1965, told the public that the U.S. had a, quote, strictly limited role in Vietnam, and he insisted that the conflict was not a crusade against communism. Similarly, when President Richard Nixon opened peace talks with the North Vietnamese in 1969, he did so without telling the American people that he had secretly bombed North Vietnam and continued to escalate the war. This lack of transparency eroded public trust in the government and ultimately led to the end of the war. In retrospect, it's clear that the government's lies about the war were a major mistake. Not only did they erode public trust in the government, but they also made it impossible to achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict. When the American people finally learned the truth about the war, they were outraged. And this outrage led to massive anti-war protests. In fact, the Vietnam War is often seen as the first truly televised war, and the images of protesters being attacked by police and of dead American soldiers being brought home in body bags had a profound impact on the American public. Eventually, the anti-war movement became so large and so vocal that it forced the government to end the war. In hindsight, it's clear that the government's lies about the war were a major mistake. Not only did they erode public trust in the government, but they also made it impossible to achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The Vietnam War was a time of great division in America. The war and the draft created a deep rift between Americans who supported the war and those who opposed it. And this division was reflected in the media as well. Newspapers and television programs often had a clear political bias, and this bias was evident in their coverage of the war. For example, many Americans who opposed the war believed that it was a mistake and that the U.S. should withdraw as soon as possible. They argued that the war was not worth the cost in blood and treasure, and that it was not in the best interest of the United States. Supporters of the war, on the other hand, believed that it was necessary to contain the spread of communism and protect our allies. They argued that the U.S. had a duty to help South Vietnam defend itself against the North, and that withdrawing would be a sign of weakness. In addition to the split between those who supported the war and those who opposed it, there was also a growing distrust of the government and the media. Many Americans felt that the government was not being honest about the war and that the media was biased in its coverage. This distrust eventually led to massive anti-war protests and a general sense of cynicism about the war. Despite all this, though, there was still hope for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In 1973, peace talks were finally able to be established, and the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam. 2 years later, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, and the war was over. Today, we remember the Vietnam War as a time of great division in America. But we can also remember it as a time when the American people came together and fought for peace. The Vietnam War was a defining moment in American history. It was a time of great tragedy and loss, but it was also a time when the American people came together and fought for peace. We can learn a lot from the lessons of Vietnam, and we must never forget the sacrifices that were made. Let us honor the fallen and work towards a better future. Thank you.